pleased and honored to be here to have a chance to talk about the Civil War in southwestern Virginia. I am not a historian, I'm a geologist, that's my disclaimer, but for the past 15 years I have been looking at the links between geology and the Civil War, and there are many, as you will see tonight. I have focused especially on southwestern Virginia. We have a great story here, but this is a very underappreciated area in terms of Civil War history. And I hope by the time you leave tonight, you will see that the mineral resources here and the railroad did indeed have a huge impact on the Civil War. If I can work the technology, I will do a brief commercial. I'm here representing several different groups. As April said, she is the chairwoman of the Montgomery County Sesquicentennial Committee and doing a terrific job. I'm on that committee and she is on our City of Radford committee. I hope you do know that we are in the Sesquicentennial, and there are lots of local events that will be going on in our region, and this is but one of them, so please watch the papers and look for announcements. There will be lots going on in the next 4 years. I do want to mention that the state of Virginia has really taken the lead on the sesquicentennial commemoration, and they've already been at this for a couple of years. I'm also here on behalf of Smithfield Plantation and Blacksburg Museum, and of course April and Terry are both intimately associated with those facilities. And if you haven't visited those, please do. They are fine and interesting places to see. Now, my talk tonight. My goal is to present an overview in about 50 minutes or so of the war in southwestern Virginia. Basically, I want to answer or try to answer the question of why would federal armies even want to come into this remote, hard to get into and out of mountainous region? What in the world could have been of interest here to draw the attention of federal strategists? And it turns out that there were things of interest here, great interest. Fighting did occur and some big battles. And I hope you will have learned more about that as we go through the evening. So first of all, I'm going to cover some quick background on Virginia's mineral resources and contributions in that area to the Confederate war effort. We'll look at the Virginia and Tennessee Railroad. That'll set up the importance of what was here. And then I want to take you on a tour of the mineral operations in this area. I want to stress especially the lead and the salt. Those were the two major ones, but there were a number of other minerals that were coming out of this area, absolutely essential to the war effort. Both sides had to have these substances to fight. So we'll take a look at that. We'll also talk about a railroad, the New River Valley campaign in May of 1864. That was a railroad raid. So my plan is, as I explain to you about what was here that drew federal interest, we'll actually take a look at some of the actions that resulted from the strategies and operations that occurred. We'll wind everything up with a quick summary and conclusions, and that'll be it. Now, I thought as I put this talk together that this image of the first battle of ironclads is going to seem like a strange slide for this talk. It definitely did not happen anywhere around here. But that picture illustrates the importance of the minerals in southwestern Virginia. The iron that was used to armor plate the Virginia was mined and smelted at the old Grace Furnace in Botetourt County near Roanoke. The coal, well, the smoke that you see coming out of the stack there of the Virginia is thought to have come from coal that was mined right here in Montgomery County in the Price Mountain area, not very far from Blacksburg. And there's some stories I want to tell you about the iron and the coal and the other resources. So that sort of sets up the importance of the minerals, at least in one historic battle. Now, let me spend a few minutes explaining the significance of the mineral contributions of the state of Virginia to the Confederate war effort. In the 1860s, in all wars, you have to have minerals to fight. And in the 1860s, these were the 5 most essential mined materials that you needed to conduct warfare. In those days, Nider or saltpeter constituted about 75% of the gunpowder. Lead was what the bullets were made from. Fortunately, that's long since been outlawed. Salt, absolutely essential in the diet of the soldiers, and the army animals had to have salt, and the list went on and on of the different applications. Iron, actually I've listed the uses in terms of importance. The railroads got more iron than any other application. The armaments industry was a close second, and then these other uses also, and even coal. Now in the 1860s, coal was not the principal fuel. Wood still was. But coal was beginning to come on strong. And the railroads had to have it, heavy industry had to have it, the great Trever Ironworks in Richmond used coal. So all of these materials, which all came from southwestern Virginia, not exclusively, the lead and the salt did, but all of these materials were necessary to wage war. Now look at this last column on the right. That is Virginia's rank in the production of these materials as compared to all other Confederate states. Virginia was the #1 producer of all of those substances except for iron, and we were a very close second to Alabama in that one. The railroad, of course, this is not just a mineral story tonight. The railroads were becoming very important in warfare in the 1860s, and it turns out that Virginia also had the most railroad track mileage of any of the southern states. About 20% of all the Confederate railroads were in the Old Dominion. There was one in particular, let me just pick out the Virginia and Tennessee for you, the V&T. That was one of the most important Confederate railroads. It was clearly the most direct connection between Eastern Virginia and the troops and resources of the West. Cutting that railroad would greatly hamper the Southern war effort in, of course, the principal theater of war, where the big battles were being fought in Central and Northern Virginia. President Lincoln himself called the Virginia and Tennessee the gut of the Confederacy. This map shows the detailed route of the Virginia and Tennessee. It began in Lynchburg, traveled across the Piedmont, popped through the Blue Ridge. The Blue Ridge is a very narrow chain right there. There's a little village in the gap in the mountains that in those days was called Big Lick. And of course now it's Roanoke, but boy, I miss Big Lick. What a great name. All right, so now the railroad is through the Blue Ridge. It's coming down the Great Valley. Central Depot is of great importance because there was a bridge over the river there, a railroad bridge. It was 700 feet long. It was the longest bridge over the biggest river spanned by the railroad. If that bridge could be cut, that would really cut Lee's lifeline to the west. We'll see some fighting there. Dublin was important because that was the command center for the Department of Southwestern Virginia, Confederate Department, and Dublin also had railroad facilities. We're interested in Wytheville because about 10 miles away down on the New River was another little village called Austinville, and that's where the Wythe County lead mines were. Here's Saltville, which already had gotten its own railroad spur. The Virginia and Tennessee was built through here in about 1856, and Saltville was already such a big maker of salt that there was a separate railroad spur over there. Now the railroad continued on into Tennessee. It went all the way down to Knoxville and Chattanooga, but of course we're interested in the Virginia part tonight. So, answer to the question that I first posed. Why were Federal strategists even interested in southwestern Virginia? Historians have debated that question, at least in terms of the order of importance, but it's really clear that there were three targets of great interest here. The lead mines, the railroad, and the salt works all had to be attacked and destroyed if possible. I like to use this map to remind us of Virginia's interesting geographic position in the Civil War. A military geographer once called Virginia a Confederate peninsula jutting into hostile northern territory. It's an interesting image and very true because on the east lay the waters of the Chesapeake Bay. The Union Navy controlled the Chesapeake Bay virtually throughout the entire war. The Monitor-Merrimack Battle settled that issue early on. Due north of Virginia was the Union homeland itself, and on the west were the states of Kentucky and soon West Virginia, and those were under federal domination throughout the war. In southwestern Virginia, where the targets of interest are, those attacks were going to have to come out of West Virginia and Kentucky until at least very late in the war. Then the Union could come up from Knoxville. But I want to emphasize to you, I told you I was a geologist. So you will see, let me back up here. Yeah. This map, it's a landforms map, topography map of mostly Virginia and the area around us. I want to emphasize the difficulty of campaigning in southwestern Virginia, especially for the Union. Now, they're the invaders. They're going to have to come in and they're going to have to get home. Now, Washington and Richmond are located for you. They're about 100 miles apart. Here's Roanoke. Now, here are the three targets that are of greatest interest. Central Depot, this is the Blue Ridge mountain chain right here. We are actually, Radford, Blacksburg, all these locations here are west of the Blue Ridge. We're in a province called the Valley and Ridge. And you can see it's got a strong northeast-southwest alignment. This is Radford in the New River Valley. Here's Austinville with the lead mines. Here's Saltville. The federal armies are going to have to start out over here in West Virginia and Kentucky and come all the way across the grain of a major mountain trend up and down over the hills and hollers, over these big sandstone mountains. Some of them are over 4,000 feet in elevation. These are not going to be easy campaigns. Now, that's the introduction. And for the next while, I want to talk about the minerals, do that survey I promised you. And I'm going to start with Nider. As the Civil War really got underway, the Confederate government became concerned about the Nider supply. I use Nider and saltpeter interchangeably, by the way. So within a year of the outbreak of the war, the Confederate Ordnance Department established a Nider Corps, which was a separate bureau within the Ordnance Department. A year later, an independent, well, the Nider Corps was the first step. Then there was the Nider and Mining Bureau that was set up within the Confederate War Department. At that point, it wasn't just about the Nider anymore, but the Nider Bureau was also in charge of procuring, let me find my list here, the iron, coal, lead, salt, and zinc. So really, by 1863, we had a Mineral Supply Bureau operating in the Confederate government. The last big change was in June of 1864. The Nider Bureau expanded its staff to include 12 chemists and what were called professional assistants, some of whom were geologists. I had to put that in there. I know you were not aware that geologists had anything at all to do with the Civil War, but indeed they did. So, now, what is Nider and where is it? Briefly, Nider, we're not going to do any chemistry tonight because I don't know very much. Nider is potassium nitrate, and the richest deposits are found in caves. Well, for years it was believed, well, that's because of the bats and the droppings accumulating, and That turns out to not be the case. There is some recent research that has shown, and when you look at the map, here's a map of all the caves in the country, but look at where the Nider caves are. They're in a fairly narrow belt. You've got to have certain conditions of temperature, can't be too warm or too cold. You got to have the right amount of rainfall, moisture, not too much, not too little, and you have to have certain soils, nitrogen-rich forest soils that tend to occur in this belt here. It turns out that most of the Nider caves in the country ended up within the boundaries of the old Confederacy. That must have been nature's gift to the Southern War effort, because they really do stand out in that location. This is a map of the Nider caves in western Virginia, and all the Nider caves in Virginia are in the west. That's because this is where the limestone is. Now, limestone is a critical kind of rock because limestone is very soluble. It dissolves. And you know a lot of this, I'm sure. Limestone is full of caves and caverns, and that gives a place for the Nider to accumulate as these waters with the right chemistry seep into the ground and find a place to precipitate. That's where the Nider builds up. It turns out that in western Virginia, something like 100 or so Nider caves have operated over the years, even before the Revolutionary War and certainly during the Revolutionary War. And by the time of the Civil War, there were about 24 Nider caves that did contribute Nider to the Southern War effort. These are pictures of just what it might have looked like in a Nider cave in those days. The vat here is interesting. The Nider workers, Peter monkeys, they called them, would go into the caves, they'd dig out the Nider, put it in these big vats, mix it with water. The water would be poured off so as to concentrate a kind of liquor of potassium nitrate, and after a while you had enough to harvest the potassium nitrate, the Nider. It turns out that about 3 men working in a good Nider cave could produce a couple of 100 pounds of Nider every 3 days or so. And it's interesting that because of the way the Nider was a naturally precipitating material, you could come back and rework the deposits within a few years. So that's what the Nider operations were like. Now, we can't spend much time on individual minerals, but I want to close this Nider overview with a comment about John Salling here. John Salling was a Confederate veteran. He lived in far southwestern Virginia in Scott County. Many people don't even know we have a Scott County. It's down there by Lee County. Natural Tunnel State Park is down there. It's a beautiful part of the world. At the age of 14 or 15, we're not sure, but John Salling began working in the local Nider operations during the war. Because he was in the Nider Corps, that meant he served in the Confederate Army. On March 16, 1959, at 113 years of age, Private John Salling, Company B, 25th Regiment of the Confederate Army Nider Corps, died. He was not only the last saltpeter to die, but evidently he was the last Confederate veteran to die, and many people believe he was the last of the Union. He outlived the Union veterans also. In other words, this tough old Peter monkey outlived everybody that fought in the Civil War. I got to tell you one quick story. This is John Salling when he was about 108 years old, and somebody is supposed to have said, how did you keep that thick shock of rich black hair? And he said, oh, well, that was easy. I never washed it. I don't recommend that, but that's what John said. Okay, we got to move on. The lead mines are up next. This historical marker I photographed, it's right on US 52 at Fort Chiswell, which is named for the British Army colonel who first opened the lead mines in the 1750s. And the sign tells us that the mines were providing lead during the Revolutionary War to George Washington's army. By the Civil War, the lead bullets were the main use of the Austinville lead. The bullets themselves weren't made at Austinville. The lead ore is there, that's where they mined it, they smelted it. The metal bars, the lead ingots, were put on horses and wagons, hauled up to the railroad, and shipped, most of it to the east, to Richmond and Petersburg. That's where the big armaments factories were, and that's where the bullets were cast. It turns out that the Austinville mines were the only significant domestic lead supply in the entire South. There was nothing else, no other lead mines near this size. There were a few pick and shovel operations here and there, but for domestic lead, this is where it was coming from. This lead production table tells us, and the records are not complete, but something like 3 million pounds plus of lead came out of the Austinville mines. It's estimated that the South used 10 million pounds of lead during the entire war. You're looking at 1/3 of the Confederate lead supply right there. As a historical note, the rest of the lead, some of it was imported through the blockade, but that got tougher as the war wore on. Some of it was recycled from civilian uses. People didn't worry about lead much in those days. The eating utensils had lead, window sash weights, it was everywhere, and civilians would contribute it. And most interesting of all, perhaps, Confederate soldiers would be sent out after the battles were over on these big battlefields to pick up the spent lead shot. That's how precious that lead supply was. I wanted to use this historical marker just to set up a couple of quick comments about some Civil War actions that occurred. We will look at Toland's raid here in 1863 and Averill's attack in 1864. In July of 1863, a Union colonel named John Toland brought about 1,000 mounted troopers from West Virginia down into our part of the world. He originally was supposed to attack the salt mines, but he was afraid they had been alerted of his arrival, so he decided to go to Wytheville and attack the lead mines. To oppose the Yankee invaders, the commander of the Department of Southwest Virginia, General Sam Jones, in Dublin, rounded up about 130 soldiers, put them on the train, and they rode the train down to Wytheville. They joined some local home guard militia there, a few dozen other defenders, and that resulted in the Battle of Wytheville. Now, this is a wonderful old historic photograph. You can imagine now as the Union soldiers trotted into town on horseback, the Confederate soldiers were there and the local defenders, and they were kind of hidden behind trees and buildings, and all of a sudden they let loose a sharp firefight. And in a few moments, since there were 1,000 Yankees and maybe 1/3 of that for the Southern defenders, the firefight was over and it was clearly a Northern victory. The Union soldiers had won, but the fighting had seen the killing of Colonel Toland. He went down in the first volley. And so the surviving Union officers weren't sure what to do next, so they just turned around and went back to West Virginia. And the lead mines were not attacked on that day. About a year later, in 1864, the lead operations were threatened again. This time it was Union troops from West Virginia once more under General William Averill. Opposing Averill was John Hunt Morgan, who was in charge of the defenses at Saltville. Now, Morgan had a ferocious reputation as a fighter. His men were called the Terrible Men. So Morgan knew that Averill was advancing on Wytheville, and he rode fast north from Saltville to meet him, and this precipitated the Battle of the Cove. You may have been along the stretch of I-77. We're just a few miles north of Wytheville. This is looking up toward Bluefield. The Battle of the Cove, this is May 10, 1864. Morgan pursued Averill's horsemen and chased and would catch them and they would fight. Then they'd break apart and Morgan would chase some more. And that kind of went on for several hours. And after a while, Averill had had enough and decided to retire from the battlefield. So the lead mines were saved again, but not for long. In December of 1864, the Union came back once more, this time under George Stoneman. We'll hear his name again. He executed a raid that did a lot of damage to Saltville and Austinville. So on this particular occasion, December of 1864, there weren't many defenders left in the area, and the lead mines were overrun by the Union soldiers. They did what damage they could, but the lead mines came back in operation, and before the war's end, which of course was April of '65, just a few months later, lead was coming out of Austinville again. Now we go to Saltville. Saltville deserves its own talk, but we'll save that for another lecture series. I say that because about 35 miles away from Austinville is the little town of Saltville. They proudly proclaim the salt capital of the Confederacy. That is not hyperbole. It is estimated that 2/3 of all the Confederate salt came out of this little valley during the war. It's a beautiful place. I hope you do go down there and visit. There's a wonderful museum with all kinds of Civil War artifacts and lots of other things. The view here is from Route 107. If you come in from Chilhowie, exit 35 on the interstate, just get off at Chilhowie, about 8 miles over, you'll see the Saltville Valley. The first thing you notice is there's a lot of water down there, and in addition to the ponds that you see, there are all kinds of springs and seeps. These are not fresh, they're briny. The groundwater here, groundwater is the rainfall and snowmelt. The groundwater sinks into the ground, goes down a couple of 100 feet, and that's where the salt beds are, under the valley floor. And the salt dissolves and the waters come back to the surface, and then you've got these natural brines just standing around all over the place. We know that in the late Ice Age, I'll do some paleontology real quick, about 15,000 years ago, large mammals, such as mammoths and mastodons, were in the Saltville Valley, coming, and a host of other creatures, but they're the most impressive, coming to these natural salt licks. One geologist has said these were the largest salt licks in the southeastern United States, so the valley was full of interesting animals. Not too long thereafter, the Paleo Indians were in this area. They too were interested in the salt. The Native Americans could simply bucket the water out of the ponds and put it on a fire in a kettle or pot, and you could make salt that way. By the late 1700s, the Saltville Valley had been found and occupied by settlers of European origin, and commercial salt operations were underway. I want to emphasize before I go any further, because I've gotten this confusion before, the salt in Saltville was never mined. Not by pick and shovel, not by digging holes in the ground. You didn't have to do that. It was always by brine extraction. At first, you just used the surface waters. By the time of the Civil War, if you had had this scene in front of you, looking at the valley, you would have seen a bunch of wooden derricks for the wells that were being drilled down to get the salt water and bring it up to the surface. Harpers Magazine was a national magazine, very popular. It was like Time or Newsweek now. And in 1857, this is 4 years before the war, Harper sent a crew, a writer and an illustrator, to Saltville to do a story on Saltville. By then, Saltville was one of the 3 largest salt-making centers in the entire country. Thank goodness for these illustrations. They are amazingly accurate. I've seen a photograph of one of these furnaces. This is called a Syracuse-type furnace. Syracuse, New York was the biggest salt maker of them all. And the technology up there was first-rate and state-of-the-art. Saltville had the same thing. And you can see the wooden, these are actually the pipes that brought the brines over from the wells. The brines went into some big iron kettles, which you cannot see. They're actually sitting in a brick furnace under the floor here. And so the heat from the furnace precipitated the salt. The workmen would come around with these giant ladles, scoop the salt out, put it in bags or baskets. Some of it was hung up to drip dry. Sometimes they put metal lids on top of the kettles and then put a basket of moist salt on that, and that finished the drying process. It was very efficient. This sketch to the right here is interesting because it shows the railroad here in 1857 and the salt's here waiting to be picked up by train. Now I hope you can make this out. It's a wagon with a pile of wood behind it. That went on constantly because the furnaces were wood-fired, never used coal in Saltville. And so the wood was accepted gratefully as payment for the salt. Now you see how the artist has drawn the hills around Saltville. There's the trees you can count on one hand, just about. That place had been denuded, and this is 4 years before the war. So timber was a very precious commodity. Now imagine this place in the war. The trains were running night and day. The wagons were lining the roads coming into Saltville. Some accounts say 1,000 wagons at a time, waiting to get the salt. This was a huge operation. This sign tells us that each Confederate state east of the Mississippi had its own furnace, meaning that the state of Georgia, the state of Alabama, all of them had come to Saltville, signed a contract with a local salt furnace, and that was the Georgia furnace or the Alabama furnace. The Confederate government was buying salt. In 1864, this was the peak year of salt production. Look at this number, 4 million bushels of salt. Now a bushel is 50 pounds. That's 200 million pounds of salt poured out of Saltville. It's no wonder that the federal strategists knew about Saltville and felt like this place has got to be taken down. And the Confederacy realized, of course, that this is a pretty important place. So in 1863, 1864, Confederate engineers drafted a set of plans for fortifications which were constructed on the hills around the Saltville Valley. Thankfully, those fortifications are still there for the most part. They've been beautifully preserved. They're one of the best examples of surviving Civil War military engineering. Fort Hatton here, it's on the south end of the Saltville Valley, is a good example of a big fort down there. This is a couple of hundred yards from the two smaller forts. These are called redoubts here. You can see the earthen walls are still in good shape. The infantry trench here that connects the two redoubts has its own parapet. You see, especially in this redoubt, now I want to show it to everybody on this side. That is beautiful preservation of a leveled surface. That's the firing platform for the cannons. You push the artillery up the ramp. There's even a dip. See a little low spot there in the parapet? That's called the embrasure for the cannon to fire through. The preservation is really remarkable here in Saltville. Eventually, the North did mount some major attacks on Saltville. There were two battles that are worth talking about for just a moment, one in October of 1864 and one in December of 1864. Now in the October battle, this gentleman here, General Stephen Burbridge, who was the military governor of Kentucky, brought about 5,200 mounted soldiers and some artillery over into the Saltville area, going up and down over those mountains, and the accounts say some of the mules slipped off the cliffside and carried wagons and soldiers to their death. It was not easy. Burbridge arrived in Saltville to find himself opposed by Confederate General John Williams, who had about 2,800 soldiers. So the Confederates were outnumbered about 2 to 1, but the Confederates had the high ground. And at Saltville, that just made a huge difference. And I want to show you an example of the topography in Saltville. We're standing on a hill called Chestnut Ridge, There's a nicely preserved Confederate trench here. This is the north side of the valley. The Union soldiers came down this hill, had to fight their way across a creek down at the bottom, and then had to try to go up this steep hillside against entrenched infantry with artillery. Amazingly enough, on this flank, they failed on the others, but on this flank, they did make it to the top of the hill. Off in the distance, they could see the salt works, the goal of the mission, but the sun was going down. They were out of ammunition. They were exhausted, and that was the high point. So Burbridge decided that was it. He decided to withdraw and left. And he left some of his wounded on the battlefield. Now that's important because on this flank, fighting right here, was an African-American unit. It was the 5th USCC, Colored Cavalry. And what happened the day after the Battle of Saltville was absolutely abominable, but it did happen. The Confederate soldiers and some partisans, some guerrillas that were there, went out on the battlefield. The Union has already withdrawn, left the wounded there, and the Confederates walked around and just shot in cold blood as many black soldiers as they could find. This is called, and some whites too, this is called the Saltville Massacre. It turns out that one of the students of Dr. Robertson, Tom Mays, has written a book called the Saltville Massacre. This deserves to be much more widely known, but it isn't because it happened in southwestern Virginia, I think, in large part. Tom Mays says that something like 45 or 50 black soldiers were murdered that day. Now that makes it one of the worst battlefield atrocities of the war. And unlike some of those others in the heat of the battle, this was cold-blooded murder the next day. Well, the October 2nd battle was a Confederate victory, and it saved the salt mines for a few months. In December of 1864, Union General George Stoneman, he's the one who also raided Austinville on this trip, got to the Saltville Valley, found very few defenders there, and he had about 5,000 soldiers, so they went into the valley and spent a whole day trying to destroy the Saltville salt operations. Well, that was ridiculous. All they'd brought along were sledgehammers to break the kettles up. So they did what they could and retreated, and in a few weeks, Saltville was making salt again and made salt until the end of the war. A couple of other minerals I want to do, and then the railroad campaign, and we'll wind things up. This picture is of the Trever Ironworks in Richmond. This was the South's largest iron-making facility. It was a state-of-the-art rolling steel mill. It's estimated that Trever made 1/2 of all the Confederate cannons and 90% of the artillery shells. So again, we're talking about a very important operation here. And most of Trever's iron ore came from Western Virginia. Trever even made the armor plate for the Virginia, and you can see the workmen here. You may not remember exactly the story of the Virginia. It was actually, it began life as a northern frigate, steam frigate called the Merrimac, a wooden ship, which the Confederates had sunk earlier. They raised it, and it had burned to the waterline, so they simply put a superstructure on it, covered it with armor, and she went off to do battle as the CSS Virginia in that historic encounter with the Monitor. A word about where the iron was coming from. Most of the iron, these are the Virginia iron operations in the Civil War. You can see that most of them, the black dots are, most of them are over here in Western Virginia. And there's one area especially I wanted to mention. This is the Cripple Creek New River Iron District. It's mostly in Wythe County, a little bit in Pulaski and Smith. This is the Speedwell Iron Furnace. It's, I've love this place. It's such an interesting structure. It's on private property. You have to ask if you can go see it. It's not preserved or anything. This is the oldest iron furnace in southwestern Virginia. It began operating before the turn of the 19th century. You can see something of the technology in that this historic photograph shows the walkway that used to come to the top of the furnace. The way these furnaces worked was they took the iron ore, mixed it with limestone and charcoal. That was called the charge, and they stuffed that in the top of the furnace. And then another charge was put on that, and as the charges worked their way down, the furnace temperatures melted the iron, and after a while, the molten iron is ready to tap off. This door right here would have, in the bottom of the furnace, and they all had this design, this would have had a clay plate that when you're ready to draw off the iron, you break the clay. A trench is dug out in front of the iron furnace. That's called the sow. And then little side trenches are dug called the piglets. That's where the term pig iron comes from. The molten iron flowed out into the sow and into the pigs, and that was the production of iron. The iron operations and the Nider works. I should have said that about the Nider operations also. The way those were scattered all over the place, not like the lead mines and the salt operations, there was never a Union attack that was designed to take out the iron or the Nider. But anytime Union raiders came across a Nider cave or an iron operation, they did not hesitate to tear it to pieces if possible. This was a big iron operation near Marion, and Stoneman's men did the destruction that you see there in late 1864. Now, the last Virginia mineral that I want to talk about is the coal. And the coal in Virginia in the Civil War was mined here in the western part, in the eastern part in the Richmond Basin. Over here in the Valley and Ridge area, there was an active coal belt in the valley fields in Montgomery County. And today, I might mention this, today's coal mining is all down here in the plateaus. These are all abandoned operations now. But we want to take a quick look at the coal mines in our own area, Price Mountain in particular. I might just mention quickly, the coal that's here in our area is the highest grade in Virginia. It's actually a semi-anthracite, better than bituminous that they're mining now. It's got a high heat content, but the geology is against us here because the rocks have been so moved around and heated and smashed up that the coal is very hard to mine. The seams are shattered. They go down at steep angles. You can't follow them very far, so that's why you can't make money mining coal around here now. But the Price Mountain coal has been mined since, we think, the late 1700s, when there's I love this story. I don't think it's ever really been documented, but there's a tradition that during the Revolutionary War, Hessian war prisoners were sent to Montgomery County to work in these coal mines because they had experience in the German coal mines. I hope that's a true story because it certainly is an interesting tale. Now, here's a map of great interest. In 1864, a Confederate engineer drew a map of Montgomery County. It's a fascinating map, and I'm sure you can find a copy around. Terry's probably got one over at the museum. Look at this thing right here. It says Government Colliery. Colliery is an old term for coal mine. The British still like that term. The importance of this is that tells us that there really was an active mine here in the Price Mountain area in the Civil War. Many people have said that it was that Price Mountain coal that was hauled over by horse and wagon. We know that for a fact, over to the James River, went down the river on barges, went to Richmond and beyond, and many people have said it was the Price Mountain coal that fired the boilers of the Virginia in her battle with the Monitor. And of course the Merrimack Seam, that name arose in the late 1800s, and it recognizes that tradition of Monitor versus Merrimack. The Merrimack's the old name for the Virginia, but that's why we have the Merrimack area and Merrimack coal seam. Well, just as quickly as I can, I'm going to cover the railroad raid. That's it for the mineral story. Hope you learned something. A lot of interesting things here related to that. In 1864, spring of 1864, the biggest battle of all ever fought in southwestern Virginia occurred. This is Floyds Mountain in Pulaski County. U.S. Grant himself was the architect of this strategy. Grant by then had command of all the Union armies, and he wanted to put pressure on Lee from a number of different directions. So he had an army coming up from the southeast to attack Richmond. That didn't amount to much. Grant was with the main army coming down from the north to advance on Richmond. There was another army in the Shenandoah Valley, and the fourth pressure point was to be southwestern Virginia. And so Grant ordered a Union general named George Crook to take his army of the Kanawha out of Charleston, come into southwestern Virginia, and attempt to cut the railroad, attack the facilities at Dublin, and then go to Central Depot and destroy that bridge. This is a picture of Crook. He and his men left Charleston in late April of 1864, about 6,500 soldiers in his army and artillery, and they made their way into southwestern Virginia. General Jenkins was his opponent. Jenkins had, again, about half the number, actually less than half the number. He probably had around 2,500 troops, which he placed north of Dublin in the Floyds Mountain area. And that's where the battle was actually fought. Now, I have to mention a couple of later to be famous people who fought in this campaign. Rutherford B. Hayes, a future president, was one of the 3 brigade commanders in Crook's army. And of course, after Grant was president, there began a string of Union veterans elected, and Hayes was number 2. Hayes, most people don't remember anything about his administration, me either, but he did start the first Easter egg roll on the White House lawn, and that's still going on. That's not bad. Give the guy credit. Oh, and I meant to mention McKinley. McKinley was a young lieutenant in Hayes's brigade, and McKinley, to me, is an ironic figure. He survived Floyds Mountain, which was a very bloody battle, and some other big bloody battles, made it through the war, and he was shot dead in Buffalo, New York in 1901 by an assassin when he was president. And Teddy Roosevelt took over as president. McKinley was the last of that string of Union veterans elected to be president. Here's a campaign area. Let's look at this very quickly. This, let me locate things for you. This is Radford, Central Depot right here. Here's Dublin. About 10 miles north is the Floyds Mountain battlefield. This is actually Floyds Mountain, but the battle was not fought on Floyds Mountain. It was down on the southeast side along the banks of Back Creek. So, and of course, here's Christiansburg. Here's Blacksburg. Crook, again, I have to emphasize the difficulty of the campaigning in this area. Crook had to work his way over the mountains. He came up this valley here, camped in the gap the night before the battle. The battle was fought here on May 9th. Next day, came over to Central Depot, attacked the bridge, retreated across the New River here at Pepper's Ferry, came up through Blacksburg, and then over the mountains, he went back to West Virginia. And I've given this talk before, and people have said, why would you go over those mountains? I mean, that's Mountain Lake up there, isn't it? Yeah, it's over 4,000 feet. But if you followed the river, sooner or later you were going to be in the Narrows, and that is a death trap. A gorge like that could be defended by very few soldiers, and the whole Union Army could have been bottled up. Crook was too good a general for that. This is the Floyds Mountain battlefield. You are looking north on Route 100. Dublin is behind you. This is Floyds Mountain. This is Back Creek flowing under Route 100. This low rise of ground that I'm standing on here is where the Confederate positions were. This is about where one of the artillery batteries was. On a beautiful spring day, Monday, May 9th, 1864, the Federal soldiers came right over this mountain. I took the picture about the same time of year. There was a red bud blooming over here. And here came the Union soldiers and attacked the waiting Confederates. I know of no other historical image of the Battle of Floyds Mountain, but this is a wonderful diagram. It was drawn by a Union veteran who fought at Floyds Mountain after the battle. And it's very accurate and interesting. It's a Union perspective. You're on the slopes of Floyd Mountain. You're looking toward the Confederates over here. This is the old Dublin-Pearisburg Turnpike. It's Route 100 now. It's been there for 150 years. Here's Hayes's brigade forming up. They're about to go charging across the little floodplain here, wade the creek, and attack the Confederates. Notice there's a Union battery here. You can see the cannon in the woods, and a shell burst from one of the rebel batteries has killed some of the, and maybe wounded, some of the soldiers. Very, very interesting diagram. The battle was short, about an hour, but very sharp. The Confederate lines broke. The rebels retreated to Dublin, gathered what they could, and went over to New River to make a stand there. In that hour of fighting, out of over 9,000 soldiers engaged, something like 1,200 plus were casualties, about 23% on the southern side, about 10% on the northern side. It was a day of carnage. The morning after Floyds Mountain, the Union soldiers arrived here on the north side of the New River. I'm standing on the traffic bridge in Bradford now and looking upstream. Here's the modern railroad bridge. That's where the Civil War bridge was. It really hasn't been moved, in position at least. So on the morning after Floyds Mountain, the Federals followed the railroad from Dublin over to Central Depot, tore up what they could, and arrived here about 10 o'clock in the morning and began to unlimber their artillery. Here on the south side, the Radford side, the Central Depot side, were the Confederates waiting and hoping to defend that bridge. This old sketch turned up in the archives of the Richmond Historical Society. It's an 1856 drawing of the not yet completed bridge over the New River. You can see the railroad come and swing across the river. It does exactly that now. If you come over and visit us at Glencoe, at General Wharton's home, you can see this time of year. The freshly excavated dirt is still piled up. They have not yet put the covering on the bridge. At the time of the battle, there was a wooden covering with a tin roof on the bridge, and that's the only thing that's missing from this diagram. Now, this is a look from the Confederate side concerning the Battle of the New River Bridge. On the bluff tops here, the Union artillery was being positioned. It's about 10 o'clock in the morning. This side, too, there's still some old remnant gun pits up here. And shortly after 10, the cannonballs began to fly, and back and forth they went. And for the next 2.5 hours or so, there was an artillery duel. One quick interesting story I have to tell you. One of the shell bursts on the Union side was amongst Hayes's brigade. And so Hayes told his mounted troopers, dismount, take cover. They all did except for one. And Hayes's diary says, in a pert and saucy manner, this trooper said, I'm not dismounting until you do. And Hayes was about to issue a firmer order, and a shell burst killed that trooper. They went over to look. It was a woman. Now, when I read that, I thought, how many women were killed in combat in the Civil War? We know that probably several hundred disguised themselves as males and got away with it for a long time. But killed in combat. Anyhow, I've tried to find out the answer to that question. And it's a very, very low number, maybe as low as 5, maybe as many as 10. But I like to say that something like 10 or 20% of all the women killed in battle in the Civil War died right there at the New River Bridge. So we do have our history here that's worth telling. Okay. During the Canon Battle, Arnhem, which is the home of Dr. John Blair Radford, our city's named for him, Arnhem was a very big house and very noticeable. It was probably the most obvious target the Union gunners had. They were supposed to be firing at the bridge, and they did, but occasionally they took a shot at Arnhem. Now, I've been in Radford for 40 years, and I've been told by many a local over there, oh, you should have seen where the cannonballs hit Arnhem, but you can't anymore because they put I got some Radford friends here and they're all going, yeah, I've heard that too. These wings have been put on the side, and this is a pre-edition photograph here. Here it is on this side. And that may be a cannonball hit mark. It would be nice if that's still there, but we don't know for sure. After this artillery duel had gone on for a few hours, the Confederates ran out of ammunition, retreated over to Christiansburg. They were going to make another stand. Crook sent his soldiers down, set the bridge on fire. It burned beautifully. And at that point, Crook decided, mission accomplished. I'm deep in enemy territory. Time to go home. And so the retreat back across the mountains began. The retreat brought them through Blacksburg, and Crook and his staff actually spent the night at the old Olin and Preston Institute. Now, I know several of you are graduates of Virginia Tech. Well, this is where Virginia Tech began life, as the Olin and Preston Institute, or so I've been told. Okay. The wind-up now. I found some quotes that do stress the significance of the lead and salt operations, and I'm going to let you read those. I don't like to read to my audiences. Let me wind up the railroad part. There's an interesting footnote. After the bridge burned and the Union retreated, the Confederate repairmen got to work right away. 5 weeks later, trains were rumbling across the New River once more over that bridge. That campaign, as one of the participants said, really didn't amount to the powder it took to conduct it. But it's an interesting bit of history, and the bridge survived till the end of the war. I want to do a wind-up here now on the railroad and the mineral industries, because they did not die. They went on for many years. The old Virginia and Tennessee eventually became part of what we now call the Norfolk and Western. The lead and zinc was produced at Austinville until 1981, from 1756 until 1981. That's 225 years of continuous mining. When those mines were shut down, that was a U.S. record for continuous operation, and I think it still stands. The salt works in Saltville eventually became part of the Olin Matheson Chemical Corporation holdings, and Olin was there for years and years making salt byproducts, everything from baking soda to chlorine gas, and finally left Saltville in 1971. I'm pleased to say that today in Saltville, they're using the old dissolved out salt caverns underground to pump natural gas for storage to move it on the market when it's ready. And the salt brines that they are pulling out to make room for the gas are now in big evaporating ponds where the salt precipitates, and they bag it up, and you can once again buy a bag of Saltville salt. So that's kind of heartwarming, I think. I have a story I want to close with, a bit of an epilogue. In 1969, a Saturn V rocket lifted off from Cape Kennedy and carried the first astronauts to the moon. That Saturn V was powered by hydrazine fuel made at Saltville from chlorine extracted from the local brines. The very salt deposits that a divided America fought over in the 1860s helped to make sure that in the 1960s, the first footprints in the lunar dust would be from the United States of America. Thank you. I've enjoyed the evening with you. I'll be glad to answer questions.